Welcome to the Secession Crisis and the Instigation of the Civil War presentation. Since the beginning of man's fallen state, he has had to battle not only with his own evil, but also the evil of a spiritual enemy. One distinguishing evil is that of a distinctive type of slavery, that of involuntary servitude, creating slaves from inculpable people. The Bible forbids such slavery in many books. Exodus 21:16 and Deuteronomy 24:7 are two such examples. Unfortunately, those who would recognize this evil and speak out against it were mostly in the minority. Over the eons, there may have been times when this kind of slavery would be abolished, but it would always return. In the new British colonies, it saw an augmentation during the 18th century. Its culmination formed in the Secession crisis to a demoniacal rage cresting in the instigation of the Civil War in the 19th century. As practiced throughout the world at the time, the British colonies in North America, those that would later become the United States, brought innocent people to be slaves early on. In addition, those against slavery, abolitionists, came early on as well. In fact, it was unheard of to be against slavery during this period. These early abolitionists were influenced by the Bible and were looking for religious freedom from their persecution in Britain. Abolitionists from two denominations in the colonies spoke out against slavery as early as 1683 and 1688 in Germantown, Philadelphia. Surprisingly enough, these were not the biblically knowledgeable Puritans speaking out. They were the Mennonites and Quakers, also influenced by the Bible, that spoke out against slavery. There is no record of Mennonites ever owning slaves in colonies or the U.S. Though some Quakers in their own denomination held slaves, they recognized the evil in the institution. Quakers finally banned anyone in their congregation from having slaves in 1761. Of course, without the influence of the Bible, the institution would most likely still be here today. It must be recognized that what happened in the colonies was very much in the control of British law at the time. The only way that anyone was going to be able to abolish slavery was through British law. Abolishment of the slave trade did not come about until 1807 in Britain. Nonetheless, in 1774, Rhode Island and Connecticut outlawed overseas importation. Disturbingly, they still allowed intercolonial slave trading. The Vermont colony banned slavery in 1777. However, slavery continued within its own colony. The northern states followed. Though some were for gradual emancipation, such as Pennsylvania in 1780, Massachusetts and New Hampshire in 1783, Connecticut and Rhode Island in 1784, New York in 1799, and New Jersey in 1804. So the evidence shows a split in the North and South around slavery already formed at this time. Of course, there was much talk against the institution during the time of the writing of the Declaration of Independence, and many founding fathers were vociferous against Britain imposing slavery. Thomas Jefferson, who penned the Declaration of Independence, stated, "He, King George III, has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. Determined to keep open a market where men should be bought and sold, as he prostituted his negative for suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or to restrain his execrable commerce. That is, he has opposed efforts to prohibit the slave trade." Benjamin Franklin also retorted about the British government. "A disposition to abolish slavery prevails in North America, that many of Pennsylvanians have set their slaves at liberty, and that even the Virginia Assembly have petitioned the king for permission to make a law for preventing the importation of more into the country. This request, however, will probably not be granted, as their former laws of that kind have always been repealed." Aside from positions against the King of England on slavery, the Continental Congress had almost passed a law banning slavery altogether in 1784. The law that was introduced stated that after the year 1800 of the Christian era, there shall be neither slavery nor involuntary servitude in any of the said states, otherwise than punishment of crimes, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted to have been personally guilty. The law had fallen one vote short of passing. Many of the founding fathers tried to set an example. George Washington, John Dickinson, Caesar Rodney, William Livingston, George Wythe, John Randolph of Roanoke, and others released their slaves after the Revolutionary War. Numerous others, such as John Adams, never owned slaves. Quite a few of the founders were influenced to do this by the Great Awakening, an awakening to biblical truths. Additionally, they had an extraordinary amount of knowledge and use of the Bible. 34% of citations in legal documents by the founders were quotes from the Bible, and it was quoted more than any other book. This is strong evidence of why slavery was almost abolished in the birthing of our nation. There were great debates over the issue during the writing of the Constitution, though there were a series of compromises to keep the new Union together. One was the 3/5 clause. Many revisionist historians tried to convince people that the framers of the Constitution were stating that slaves were only 3/5 of a person in this clause. This was far from the truth, as it was abolitionists who sought to minimize the effect of slaveholders from forcing their slaves to vote their way. Even the great abolitionist Frederick Douglass, in his day, excoriated this notion of revisionists by stating, "A black man in a free state is worth just 2/5 more than a black man in a slave state, as a basis of political power under the Constitution." Therefore, instead of encouraging slavery, the Constitution encourages freedom by giving an increase of 2/5 of political power to free over slave states. Taking it at its worst, it still leans to freedom, not to slavery. Regrettably, Article 4, Section 2, Clause 3 was not a good compromise. It went against the biblical principle pronounced in Deuteronomy 23:15. If a slave has taken refuge with you, do not hand him over to their master. Let them live among you wherever they like and in whatever town they choose. Do not oppress them. To enforce this article, the Fugitive Slave Law was enacted in 1793. Nevertheless, when some of the first laws concerning slavery took effect, the momentum was with the abolitionists. The Northwest Ordinance prohibited slavery, and President Jefferson signed off on a bill prohibiting the import of slaves in 1808. Still, ships with slaves to sell came in from the South, as there was an even greater need for cheap labor after the cotton gin was invented. Another law passed in 1820 made participation in the slave trade an act of piracy to counter the illegal influx. So in the beginning of the 1800s, it seemed like slavery was on the way to being abolished. But the enemy of man had other plans. Even though Jefferson owned slaves himself, in 1805 he acknowledged, "I have long since given up the expectation of any early provision for the extinguishment of slavery among us." While there are many virtuous men who would make any sacrifice to effect it, many equally virtuous persuade themselves either that the thing is not wrong or that it cannot be remedied. The devil would eventually get what was due him. Now we must keep in mind that the enemy of man works through, as Paul speaks about in Ephesians 6:12, the powers of this dark world, and his power is in governances as well. This was probably why the founders reasoned, as the old saying goes, government is a necessary evil. So it behooves one, with this in mind, to look at the powers of the party system controlling the three branches of the federal government during the antebellum period, especially the executive and House, where the people voted in their representatives. From the beginning of the first president's time in office, 1789 to 1792, there virtually were no political parties in the House and Senate. Then those who argued for a strong central government began calling themselves Federalists, and, logically, the others began calling themselves Anti-Federalists. Pro-slaver and abolitionist representatives debated as individuals. The first parties elected were in 1796, but pro-slaver and abolitionists were still in all parties. As represented in this slide, the South then began to congregate in the Anti-Federalist Democratic Republican Party and the North in the Federalist. In 1819, the Missouri Territory appealed for admittance as a slave state. Then House Speaker Henry Clay introduced the first Missouri Compromise. The northern part of Missouri, Maine, entered as a free state. Southerly Missouri came in as a slave state. In 1820, both Maine and Missouri became states. This caused the divide between northern free states and southern slave states even more distinct. The first talk of secession came in 1832. Led by John C. Calhoun, who was working in President Jackson's administration at the time, South Carolina tried to nullify a federal tariff. Establishing a state's right to nullify this federal law would have been a path to nullify other federal anti-slavery acts. Democrat President Jackson, who felt the full power of the federal government, would have none of it. Realizing that no other state would help them against the federal government, South Carolina relented. Calhoun was then asked to resign by Jackson soon after. Still, pro-slaver Democrats had been resolute to find a way to secede if and when the time came. During this period, the major parties, Democrats and Whigs, had both pro- and anti-slavery representatives, with the exception that the Democrats were prone to the position that slavery was nobody's business but for the people that owned them. Anti-slavery representatives had very little power on the national level, so they formed their own party. Regrettably, they only garnered around 10,000 votes in 1840. From the time of the Jackson administration to the Buchanan administration, the seat of the presidency was filled by either a weak-willed Whig or pro-slaver Democrat. Under the guidance of leaders such as William Lloyd Garrison, Elijah P. Lovejoy, Frederick Douglass, and Harriet Beecher Stowe, the abolitionist movement expanded during the 1830s. Still, it was a dangerous time for the abolitionists as they were the minority in every state. The abolitionist sages are considerably better known today than the theorists of the Democrat slaver activists. Minor players such as Henry Hughes and major ones like George Fitzhugh believe, contrary to the theory of the Lockean social contract, that government, not natural rights, was the nature of public governmental development. They believe that slavery was a positive good, and that the principles of the Declaration of Independence should be overruled. This is a familiar tone with the philosophies of the liberals of the present day. Hughes' writing on slavery were about the economic benefits that slaves had on what he termed warrantyism. He stated, "Laborers never want work. If they do, provision for its supply is warranted. Laborers are never out of employment. In the distribution of the warranty economy, the distributor is the state of function of justice. Wages are warranted. Wages are variable, but these variations are never below the standard of comfortable sufficiency of necessaries. Want is eliminated. There are no poor. All have competence. Capital and labor are syntogenistic. The substance of all is warranted to all." Fitzhugh supplemented Hughes' thoughts and proclaimed, "Slavery is a form, and the very best form, of socialism." He went on to write that a Southern farm is the beau ideal of communism, and that there is no rivalry, no competition to get employment among slaves, as among free laborers. Wealth is more equitably distributed than at the North, where a few millionaires own most of the property of the country. Besides Hugh and Fitzhugh, there were other anti-abolitionist organizations as well. John C. Calhoun led the way for the slavery proponents in Washington, D.C. He vociferously expounded the disparagement of America's founding principles. Calhoun wrote, "As, then, there never was such a state as the so-called state of nature, and never can be, it follows that men, instead of being born in it, are born in the social and political state, and of course, instead of being born free and equal, are born subject not only to parental authority, but to the laws and institutions of the country where born and under whose protection they draw their first breath." He similarly wrote in agreement to Fitzhugh's philosophy that these great and dangerous opinions have their origin in the prevalent opinion that all men are born free and equal, that which nothing can be more unfounded and false. He also condemned the founders' thought on the principle that man is entitled to the laws of nature and nature's God, as stipulated in the Declaration of Independence, and relied heavily on that period's knowledge of science. Calhoun went on to espouse the assertion, as Fitzhugh had, that slavery was better than wages of free men in the capitalist industrial North. Senator Thomas Hart Benton of Missouri later reproved the kind words about Calhoun after his death on March 31st, 1850, stating, "There may be no vitality in his body, but there is in his doctrines." Some argue that Calhoun's influence was so great that he was the one that started the Civil War. Either way, the enemy made good use of Calhoun's time here on earth. Legislation and judicial action from 1840 to 1860 came with increased frequency. In 1842, the Supreme Court of the United States, otherwise known as SCOTUS, upheld the 1793 anti-slavery law in its decision of Prigg v. Pennsylvania. The decision affirmed that slave owners had a right to retrieve their property. President Polk during this time expanded the territories of the South with the winning of the Mexican War. Northern Whigs cried foul, thinking that the war was a ruse to expand slavery. The Democrats virtually said they would expand slavery in their 1844 Democratic Party platform. The Wilmot Proviso was then introduced by Congressman David Wilmot of Pennsylvania, which passed the House but died in the Senate. The proviso was designed to abolish slavery within the land attained as a consequence of the Mexican War. The bill rose again several times after the first proposal. Then things changed again when California was admitted as a state. It was an odd-number state that gave free states the upper hand in the number of representatives in the Senate. In October of 1849, John C. Calhoun called upon Democrat delegates of the South to assemble a convention the following June. The implication was obvious. If the Southern Democrats didn't get their way through the federal government, they would secede and thus abolish the right of northern free states not to support slavery. A compromise solution was supported by Henry Clay and Whig Senator Daniel Webster. Later, the cause was picked up by Democrat Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois. It was finally signed into law by then-President Zachary Taylor after Douglas split the compromise into different parts. The crisis was only abated for a little while. Part of the Compromise of 1850 was the Fugitive Slave Act. This new act not only let Democrats of the South come into free states and take by force runaway slaves and free-born citizens, it authorized harsh penalties on citizens in case of denial of such help, and mandated local and federal law enforcement to assist as well. This imposition on free men of the North to actively participate in something they detested as an abomination created more novitiates to the cause of emancipation than any abolitionist sermon could ever have. Again, the right of the people of free states were trampled on. Stephen A. Douglas later found himself in a dilemma. In 1854, he saw the value of the railroad system and then realized that he needed to repeal some of the language that restricted slavery in the Northern Territory in the Compromise of 1850. He devised a scheme that would allow slavery to spread by popular sovereignty. The language in the bill was without a doubt intended to have pro-slavers come into the new Kansas Territory and voted in as a slave state. The bill passed in 1854, outraging so many that the Republican Party was formed. The outrage would predicate the coming carnage in Kansas. Douglas had created about as many causes for the Civil War as Calhoun. Still, Democrats held control of the three branches of government all the way through to 1860. Through the years of 1855 and 1856, it could be argued that the first shots of the Civil War had begun in Kansas, just without the declaration of war. Skirmishes between slavers and abolitionists had initiated, mostly with armed slavers attacking abolitionists first. Slavers first attacked the town of Lawrence, and then John Brown arose to counterattack at Pottawatomie Creek. By the end of 1856, almost 200 men had been murdered. Later, Republican Senator Charles Sumner was beaten almost to death by Democrat Congressman Preston Brooks of South Carolina. Sumner had disparaged not only Democrat Senator Douglas, but Brooks' uncle as well, Democrat Senator Andrew Butler of South Carolina, in a fairly long speech on the Senate floor. The bloodshed was now spreading in all quarters. Effects that generated the Civil War were intensified at an even greater rate. In 1857, the SCOTUS, led by Democrat Justice B. Taney, ruled that Dred Scott, being black and a slave, had no standing to sue, and that all blacks, slave or free, had no rights, and that slavery could not be banned in any U.S. territories. The states' rights Democrat slave states cleaved unto this decision. In that same year, the Kansas Territory split into two separate free and slave areas. It was a precursor to the coming split of the nation. In 1858, Republican Abraham Lincoln was nominated by his party to be their senator of Illinois and delivered his famous House Divided speech. Though he lost the race to Democrat Stephen Douglas, he became their cynosure of the Republican Party. 1859 is a bit of a respite for the man that soon would be president. In that following year, John Brown also gained infamy among the Democrat South and martyred hero status among the North. On October 16th, he raided the armory at Harper's Ferry. On the 17th, he was discovered and took hostages. He and his men were held up in a firehouse within the armory. Robert E. Lee and J.E.B. Jeb Stuart are ordered to capture him. By 6:30 a.m. of the morning of October 18th, Stuart ordered Marines to storm the firehouse, and many of Brown's men were killed or wounded, though 5 escaped. Brown himself was severely wounded. On December 2nd of that year, he was hung in Charleston, Virginia. He had been stoic from the time of his capture to the day of his hanging, and even admired by some of his captors. The events of 1860 and 1861 came in a crescendo of events and then broke with the thunder of war. Beginning as soon as January 5th of 1860, Senator Jefferson Davis of Mississippi called for secession. From April 23rd to May 3rd, the Democratic Party met to choose a candidate for president, but could not decide who it would be. They chose to continue the discourse in Baltimore the following month. On May 16th, the Republican convention convened, and Abraham Lincoln was among 12 candidates. He won the nomination, and Hannibal Hamlin of Maine was elected to be his vice president. In the South, Democrats there held their own convention, but took a wait-and-see approach. June 18th through the 28th, the Democrats rejoined in Baltimore, but once again the scheming Douglas could not win the nomination until some delegates left on the 22nd. This was when the rules were changed to require only 2/3 of those present to nominate, and so Douglas was nominated on the 23rd. It could be argued that Douglas had split the Democratic Party at this point. Southern Democrats then held their own convention at the end of June and nominated Vice President John C. Breckinridge. On the 5th of October, Governor William Henry Gist of South Carolina let it be known to other southern states that his state may be ready to secede. The pot began to boil over in the nation. The lid began popping off when, on November 6th, Republican Abraham Lincoln won the presidential election with only 39.7% of the vote because the Democrat Party had split and weakened themselves over the last few years. By the 10th of the same month, Southern senators began to resign. Near the end of the month, on the 23rd, Fort Sumter was reported to be endangered. Tendering his resignation, since Democrat President Buchanan refused to send support to troops in Charleston, Secretary of State Lewis Cass, on December 12th, left the Buchanan administration. Even though the Senate had passed a pro-slavery bill called the Crittenden Compromise, South Carolina officially approved secession on December 20th. The rest of December was filled with tension as Fort Moultrie was evacuated, the federal arsenal in Charleston was overtaken by rebels, and Fort Sumter's evacuation was demanded as Charleston was notified that a federal ship was coming in support of the fort. 1860 ended in fearful trepidation. Finally, the devil began to reap his harvest of destruction beginning on January 9th as the first shots were fired from Morris Island on the federal ship Star of the West. She was headed toward Fort Sumter to resupply her. Secessionist shots were then fired from Fort Moultrie forcing the Star of the West to retreat just a mile away from Fort Sumter. This was arguably the first act of war by a secessionist state. It was done months before Lincoln could have done anything, as he was not to be inaugurated until March 4th. By February, a convention of seceded states approved an interim constitution that created the Confederate States of America. On that same day, the convention chose out of several candidates Jefferson Davis as interim president. Surprisingly, they chose a pro-Union and friend of Abraham Lincoln, Governor of Georgia Alexander Stephens. In March, the Constitution of the Confederate States was ratified by a vote of 100 ayes to 7 nays. In Article 1, Section 9 of the Confederate Constitution, it stated, "No bill of attainder, ex post facto law, or law denying or impairing the right of property in Negro slaves shall be passed." In Article 4, Section 3, it stated, "In all such new territory, the institution of Negro slavery, as it now exists in the Confederate States, shall be recognized and protected by Congress and by the territorial government, and the inhabitants of the several Confederate States and territories shall have the right to take such territory any slaves lawfully held by them in any of the states or territories of the Confederate States." The Democrat South was determined to spread slavery if it could. On April 12th, Fort Sumter was fired upon, and the artillery fire was constant until the fort was given up on the following day. To many historians, this was the official beginning. The secession crisis had become the Civil War.